Hello, welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. Happy to be with you once again. We've got at least another week of this Penn State football season to go. 5 months ago, we set foot at our first Penn State practice of this fall. It has turned into winter. It has turned into game 16, and that'll be against Notre Dame, as it turns out. We're going to learn a lot more about the Fighting Irish. We'll get some early intel from a Notre Dame reporter as they head down to South Florida with 13 victories. They picked up number 13 on Thursday against SEC champion Georgia, beat them 23-10, setting up a semifinal matchup next Thursday, January 9th, against these Penn State Nittany Lions. We will be on location to cover things. We'll get the change out of our pants, get in some shorts for South Florida weather, and we'll be down there Monday all the way through next week. So you can look forward to our coverage at Lions247.com. For now, we're all back in Happy Valley in between trips. Daniel Gallen joins me now, and you heard from him live from the quarterfinal round down at the Fiesta Bowl in Arizona late on Tuesday night into Wednesday. If you heard that, we appreciate it. If you didn't, I highly encourage you. We spent about 40 minutes or so in our post-game podcast discussion. Me from here in Central PA, Daniel from down there inside the stadium, closing up shop after Penn State's victory over Boise State. Daniel, welcome back to town, although it's just for a bit, and welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tyler. It's a bit of a whirlwind right now. It was a pretty hectic 48 hours there, but it's the playoffs. You got to raise your game and be ready for anything.
You have definitely raised your game. You were out in the desert, and then 24 hours later, you're watching Penn State basketball action in the BJC in cold Central PA. I know you'll go to Philly for the basketball game in Palestra on Sunday. Then we're all going down to South Florida on Monday. So, yeah, it has been a whirlwind winter thus far, and now we know where it leads next. We've known since Tuesday night that it would take Penn State to South Florida. We just didn't know whether it would be Georgia out of the SEC or Notre Dame of the independent competition. It is Notre Dame, Daniel, and 23-10 victory. 17 of the 33 total points were essentially scored in a minute by Notre Dame at the very end of the second quarter, and then at the start of the third quarter with a kickoff return for touchdown. Georgia, working without their starting quarterback, Carson Beck, who's out with an injury, could not generate much offensively, and ultimately Notre Dame was able to really get the stranglehold on this thing down the stretch. 20th matchup between these two teams when they get together next Thursday. It's 9-9-1 overall. Penn State has the last victory in this series, but you've got to go all the way back to 2007 for that. Early on, Daniel, it's a 1.5-point betting advantage for the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. It would be the third time that Penn State enters a matchup as an underdog. The other two times this year, they've lost. Ohio State and Oregon, both times they were a 3-point underdog for those matchups. Again, 1.5 points for the Fighting Irish at this stage. What's your initial reaction to it being Notre Dame, it not being Georgia, and what it all means for the Nittany Lions?
I think first, from the big picture perspective, I think that it's a pretty cool draw for Penn State. I mean, you hear people talk about the quote unquote helmet games when it's just two programs that are established in the long history of college football and they square off. And I think you get that with Penn State and Notre Dame. We all know that Notre Dame is a national program. As a son of a Northeast Philly Irish Catholic, I spent a lot of Saturdays with NBC on TV and learned a lot about the Fighting Irish when I was growing up. And so I think it's just from that perspective, in terms of these two teams on this stage, given their histories, I think that it's a really, really cool matchup from that perspective. And I think what you want to see as a college football fan. In terms of the actual matchup of it, I saw you post some things yesterday about how you think this is a good draw for Penn State, and I agree. I think they match up pretty well with Notre Dame, and I think that this is going to be a very, very fun physical game. I think that it might be one of those games that's like 20-17, 23-20 in that range, and it ends, and we're exhausted from watching it, from how these teams play and go at it. So, I think it's going to be really fun. I think that there's some individual things that I'm really interested in seeing, like, watching Riley Leonard, plow into the trenches over and over again as a runner, seeing that and then contrasting it with how we saw Penn State, playing so physically against Ashton Becky and Boise State. That's something that really stands out to me as something that we could see. And then just how the Penn State offense might match up against the Notre Dame defense that is also really physical, very skilled, and is dealing with some depth issues. And so, I think that there's going to be a really good push-pull here, and I'm excited to spend the next week kind of pulling it apart.
Yeah, we'll have fun. We'll do it a little bit later on this show. From Notre Dame's angle, they're coming off a big high. I know people are really excited in Happy Valley right now. It's been a kind of a breakthrough couple of weeks for the Nittany Lions. But one thing that lacks on their resume this postseason, Daniel, is the win over a blue blood. They got SMU, they got Boise State. Depending on who you are in the country, you're either saying that's ridiculous, Penn State shouldn't have that, or you're saying you play who's in front of you and you beat them the best you can. Penn State won by 28 against SMU in the opener. They won by 17 in the Fiesta Bowl over Boise State. And now it's only blue bloods left. You've got Notre Dame here with you in South Florida to play in the Orange Bowl. One day later at the Cotton Bowl in Dallas, you'll get Texas, who got the chance to go back home to the Lone Star State after a major scare against Arizona State. I mean, that was down to the wire. And if you missed the end of that, you missed a really exciting matchup. They will take on Ohio State, who obliterated previously unbeaten Oregon. It was a 34-0 game in the second quarter in the Rose Bowl. So big picture, Daniel, before we take some time to discuss Penn State players who've individually stepped up during this collective success, the Final Four is set. 8 teams are out of the mix now. More than 100 teams are out of the mix for a national championship. When you think back to the start of the season, it's Texas, Ohio State, Penn State, and Notre Dame. What do you make of that group?
It's a fun group, and I think to have 2 Big Ten teams, at this juncture, and then I've always kind of personally considered Notre Dame to be a spiritual Big Ten team, even if they have that ACC affiliation right now. I think that this year went a little bit differently than how some people went. When we're talking in August, like, could the SEC get 5 teams into the college football playoff? Obviously, that's not what happened, and I think is a pretty entertaining tournament. I know that a lot's been made about the margins of victory and everything. I think a lot of people have done a really nice job of putting this into the historical context of the college football playoff, and how overall there really haven't actually been that many close games in the decade of the 4-team tournament. And so I think that, to me, that was something that was a pretty interesting subplot, and is probably going to be a discussion point moving forward. I know I came out onto this podcast multiple times and said that I would take the bye over everything, and then all 4 teams that had the bye lost. I think that was a little bit of a twist for me, but I also think that was a little bit circumstantial, where Boise State and Arizona State were both double-digit underdogs. Georgia had a brand new quarterback after their starter got hurt. And then Oregon just had the draw of potentially the most talented and the best team in the country in the second round. And so I think that a lot of people are going to try to make some broad sweeping generalizations from this first 12-team playoff, but I think that there are some very particular quirks to it this year. I think that the seeding stuff will probably need to get taken care of. But the one thing that I go back to, I forget exactly who said this, and I feel bad that I don't have the source to cite, but this structure was made I think before this last round of major realignment, and so the committee was working inside the structure that was given to them by the CFP, by ESPN, and whoever else. And so it's just kind of I think that there's some kinks to the system, and that's just how things work sometimes. And so I think overall these first couple of rounds were a lot of fun. Those on-campus games were great. I think in the future, if we can get these quarterfinals on campus too, that would also be awesome. Give a team like a Boise State, give a team like an Oregon, the chance to host a home game. I think that would be really neat. But
wait. Daniel is willing to give up 3 full days of vitamin D in the desert so that Beaver Stadium get packed again at the very end of December. So that's very selfless on your part.
We don't need to talk about how I spent most of my 3 days in Phoenix again. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think that we had some conversations coming back from the Fiesta Bowl and in the shuttle about what college football looks like right now, what it could look like in the future. I do think that there need to be some changes, but you roll the ball out and you don't think about that stuff for a while. And I think that has been a lot of fun with these games. And I'm really looking forward to being down in South Florida, for Penn State, Notre Dame, and then flying back up on Friday and getting somewhere, getting a beer and watching Texas Ohio State. Like I think that game is going to be a ton of fun. So I think that in the end, it's college football. This is what we kind of revolve our lives around for 12 months of the year, and I think that it's been paying off so far.
Yeah, and you brought up some good points there. The talking point I'm more than happy to get behind, because there's a lot of bad oones I don't agree with in this playoff conversation. Is let's get rid of the automatic bye tie-ins to the 4 conference winners. I think that was exposed a bit this year. Penn State would have ended up, if they go by rankings, with one of those buys as the number 4 team in those rankings.
That's another take that I have is
right.
that I don't think Penn State is number 4 if the structure is different. Like I saw some things, people talking about like in a 14 playoff, Penn State would have been in. I don't necessarily think that's the case, because the committee was making their rankings for a 12-team playoff. Yeah. And so you can afford to not punish Penn State for losing to Oregon. But I think that if this is a 14 college football playoff, that Big Ten championship game, even with Oregon's resume and with Penn State's resume, that's an elimination game. In my view, I think that's how it works. And so I think that there's a lot of stuff that we're all getting used to. I do agree with you that I like the idea of having the tie-ins for the conference champions, getting those buys. And then it's just one of those things where everything in the sport is just changing so often, and it's really hard to get everything to line up, and it just didn't line up this year. The other thing that that popped into my head while watching that Georgia Notre Dame game, it was such a physical game. We know that Notre Dame has had some injuries and things like that. Is that there's a bit of a cruel irony where you're putting these college football playoff teams into the longest seasons possible in an era when it's pretty much impossible to maintain your depth or it's a near impossible task to maintain your quality depth because of the portal and everything like that. And so I think that with some of the stuff I talked about earlier, and with that, there's a lot of stuff that some people need to sit down, I think, on January 21st and however long it takes, say, okay, this is how we need to structure things, this is how things need to go. But that was another thought that I had about where we are, is that in a 16 game season, depth is more important than ever. And you're putting these teams in position where it can be really hard to keep some of that depth.
We'll talk about that in just a minute. Some guys who have stepped up for Penn State, some of it is because they've had to turn to depth. But I just wanted to note, I think the CFP seedings, I had people texting me like, they didn't understand the seedings. They didn't understand. Like they thought that, wow, these are all upsets. And this is someone who doesn't really follow football. And I'm trying to think, it's not really an honest way to present your playoff to the average consumer out there. Not the average consumer doesn't probably have a 24/7 sports subscription and follows this every day, although we wish they did. But I think that, if you're just checking in, what does the college football playoff look like? You're not getting an honest interpretation of how the college football season went and how these teams are ultimately viewed from a national perspective by seeing that number 3 next to Arizona State and that number 4 next to Arizona State, that number 3 against Boise on Boise State side. Just think it's a little confusing overall for people, and it's obviously messing with the matchups early in this matchup. We'll see what happens, but at the end of the day, anyone who's winning this year doesn't have anything to apologize for. You have done what you're supposed to do. You're in the Final Four. And of course, Ohio State's across that bracket. I'll just mention, 1 win away from getting a rematch in the national championship game in Atlanta on January 20th. This goes against everything that James Franklin's 1-0 mindset has, but we don't work in that building. We don't have paychecks signed by Penn State or James Franklin, so we don't have to live.
We're never in that building.
We're very rarely in that building. And so looking ahead a little bit selfishly, if it were to come to that, to me, it's the ultimate risk reward scenario, Daniel, because either one, you beat finally the Buckeyes and you hoist that national championship trophy for the first time in 38 years. And there is a collective scream of joy from the entire Nittany Lions nation, or you lose for a 9th consecutive time to the Buckeyes, and you have to stand there in person on the field in Atlanta as they raise the trophy for the 3rd time since 2002. And then there's a collective wave of depression, although you got to keep the silver lining. Penn State got to the national title game. That'll be a conversation we can stow away for down the road if they get to that point. But some storylines that are really interesting continue to pop up. Let's talk about some of the individual standouts that we have noted during the postseason run. And I'm including in that postseason run the Big Ten championship game in Indianapolis back on December 7th. Penn State had those 12 regular season matchups. They've had 3 matchups since then. They'll get a 4th. And I think the first one is very obvious in terms of players who have stepped up for this program, Daniel. Kaytron Allen. We went through his postseason resume on our post-game podcast on Tuesday. It's just been absolutely amazing how he has just turned up the Jets and become a focal point for this offense. I said before, he kind of felt like he was barely holding on to supplemental player status for this offense in terms of his efficiency and his production in November. All of a sudden, I'm watching Penn State try to put this one away. And when it's a one-score game there in the second half, I'm thinking internally, they got to get the ball to Kaytron Allen. And I don't recall the last time I was of that mindset for this Nittany Lions offense, but we are there now.
Yeah, I think I said it, mostly in jest in the second half of the game in the press boxes. I was like, yeah, there's really no reason for anyone but Kaytron Allen to touch the ball for the rest of the game. I mean, that's how he was playing. I mean, he was dominant. Obviously, a lot of credit goes to the Penn State offensive line and the way that they were playing. But Allen's just ability to have the patience, hit the hole, break a couple tackles, and then get some extra yards in the second level. I know that we've talked about what he isn't in terms of his speed and his burst and that extra gear when he gets out there, but he can still get you, 8, 10, 12 yards. He had the 25-yard touchdown against SMU. I think he had at least one 20-yard run against Boise State. He had the 50-yard run called back. He can do some things in that second level. So I've just been so impressed with Kaytron Allen. I think he's always been a fun player to watch. Since back to his freshman year, but it's definitely at a different level right now.
And Nick Singleton hasn't been a guy who's stepped up in the postseason, although he has been very effective. I would say he stepped up in November and he just hasn't stepped down since then. Coming off that injury, he's been on a roll. But we got to note what these two guys have done combined in 3 postseason games, 2 in the playoffs, 1 back in Indy. Kaytron Allen, Nick Singleton, 703 total yards, 6 scores on 89 offensive touches. That's 78 rushes, 11 catches. That's an 8-yard average, Daniel, every time they touch the ball over the course of these last 3 times. And as we come to expect, relatively even split, 47 going to Kaytron Allen, 42 going to Nick Singleton. And we got to give the offensive line credit because both those guys, Kaytron and Nick, are quick to do that when we ask them about their success. And when you discuss the offensive line of late, it's really difficult to ignore what Nolan Rucci has looked like since he had to step up into that right tackle position. We had a lot of questions if that was going to be maybe a downgrade or a problem for this offensive attack going toward the postseason when you lost Anthony Donko, impressive redshirt freshman tackle, for the remainder of the way with an injury in November. And yet after a little bit of shaky moment, maybe early for Rucci as he's getting settled in, he's been among this team's top-rated offensive lineman, if not the top offensive lineman in each of these postseason matchups. And you watch him over the course of the game, you're not concerned about Rucci anymore. In fact, I'm just wondering what the right tackle competition might look like next year, because Rucci doesn't seem like a guy, the way he's playing right now in the spotlight, who's going to be ready to take a big step back and be a backup again. So I think this is a really cool success story. He's been a major physical development story for Penn State since he made the move from Wisconsin. I think he's about 20 pounds heavier than he was through his 3 years with the Badgers. He hardly played during his time at Wisconsin, former 5-star prospect, and yet here he is, an offense that is really clicking on the ground, an offense that is 2 wins away from winning a national title. He is in the crux of it.
Yeah, Rucci's done a really nice job holding that down. I think from my perspective, as someone when I watch the games, I'm still looking at everything holistically, and I'm no offensive line expert. But so to me, it's when I don't notice Nolan Rucci over the course of the game, that's when things are going well. It's when you notice someone on the offensive line, the way that I watch games, live, that's when you get a little bit concerned. So I think a lot of credit goes to him. And I mean, yeah, I've just been so impressed because, I think there were some questions about that right tackle position when this started, because this is one of those things where you talk about, watch what they do, don't listen to what they say, that we heard, all the time about yeah, there's a lot of confidence in Rucci if they need him over the course of the season, and how impressed James Franklin was with him, but he wasn't playing. And we've seen that in the past where Penn State will rotate players, especially on the offensive line, if they think they have two starting caliber players. It was pretty much the Anthony Donka show the whole time, outside of a couple different, opportunities for Rucci here and there. And so, that was Donka's job. So for Rucci to come in, in that Minnesota game, Maryland game, find his footing through there, and then these two playoff games, really, really look good and be solid. I think a huge credit to him, and they'll need him to continue that against a Notre Dame front that can be pretty physical and pretty aggressive.
Yeah, across the trenches. Look, we have some questions about Abdul Carter. He put out a kind of a fun little social media tease for us yesterday with Darth Vader and this recovery process. And people who follow Star Wars told me a lot more about the details of what it means. But it was basically indicating that I am working towards a return here, and I'm a big bad man. And so we'll learn more. We have James Franklin in a press conference setting on Saturday. We have defensive coordinator Tom Allen on Sunday. You'll have all that coverage at Lions247.com. I don't expect to get full clarity on Abdul Carter's situation, but regardless, we know Denai Dennis-Sutton is going to play a big role for Penn State, and he's another guy that lands on this list because Daniel, highly effective, disruptive. The last couple of weeks when playoff time has rolled around, he had a sack and a half against SMU last week. We know the threat that they felt Kevin Jennings presenting at the quarterback position. He was a key part in making sure they kept him corralled and ultimately struggling for much of that matchup. And then against Boise State, he goes for 2.5 tackles for loss. One of those is a sack, 6 total tackles, which is his highest total of the season. And there were some moments where, you depending on your perspective, you may have hated what Denai Dennis-Sutton was doing in the extracurriculars, or you may have really embraced it and loved the energy he brought. But regardless, he brought the energy, and he's bringing the production. And this is a guy who's a few years removed from being a 5-star recruit. He's been overshadowed this season by Abdul Carter. We understand why that's the case, but he's putting a reminder out to people right now. He's serving some notice.
Yeah, Denai Dennis-Sutton is one of those players who I think when is at his best is really playing right at that line between, great intensity, everything, and then, maybe taking a step over and, getting a penalty, something like that. I think that it was I forgot to bring it up on the post game show, but there was when he drew that very key hands to the face penalty where he was on the rush, and I think it wiped out the Boise State touchdown. Penn State was trying to sub Amin Vanover into the game for Dennis-Sutton, and he was lined up at the left end position and waved Vanover off. And Vanover was kind of like, just sort of shrugged and ran off. And then Dennis-Sutton draws the penalty. I mean, that's, I think, kind of shows the focus that he has, where, he's not going to leave the game. And he just plays with such an impressive intensity. I pulled the quote from Max Granville, the freshman, after the game, where I asked him, I was like, what's that like when Denai is playing like that, where it's just like he's a man possessed and is just all over the place? And Granville said, quote, "It's scary. Like, I'm not necessarily scared of him, but I can imagine being on another team. He's got this big, deep voice, this 6'5", 270, like monster of a man wreaking havoc on offenses. I mean, that's crazy." And I think that quote there sort of sums up the Denai Dennis-Sutton experience when he's really on and really making things happen.
I'm glad you brought up Amin Vanover, because this isn't quite the whole postseason sample size, but it was when Abdul Carter exits the game in the second quarter, you need an answer. Amin Vanover provided one. I thought he had a pretty rough day overall, and the defense did too at times against Ohio State when Denai Dennis-Sutton wasn't available. That was a ways back, but that was when we saw this defensive end depth really tested. Thought it was a much better response from that group collectively, and specifically Amin Vanover in the heat of the moment against Boise State. Vanover, 6 tackles to his credit, like Denai Dennis-Sutton, 1 sack, 2 tackles for loss. You go back to the Oregon game, which was pretty nightmarish for much of it on defense, but he had a sack in that game too. He had a pass deflection. And Amin Vanover has been around this program a lot. He's played a couple different positions. He's been a backup for the last couple of seasons, but we've noted in the past how important him and Smith Vilbert have been to the plan. I think Amin Vanover more so than Vilbert, as it's proven to be. But you look what he's doing. You look what this defensive line is doing with some of the defensive tackle issues. Devontae Thomas, Kozai Izar are playing more snaps than they ever had in their career. And Devontae Thomas has been here 6 years. So he's playing more than he ever has in those 6 years in this postseason. He's over 50 snaps the last couple playoff games. He wasn't over 50 snaps at all during the season. So throw Amin Vanover in there, throw those defensive tackles in there. We know Zane Durant's been balling out all season, but the other guys have stepped up to that position. And I think what you're trying to paint the picture here is the defensive line has brought the goods to the playoff tournament.
Vanover is one of those guys who has really impressed me over the course of the past couple of years. I mean, great energy player, has a knack for making big plays in a couple different spots. I think the first time we were ever in the press box as coworkers in the Ohio game, I made a call that he was going to get a sack on a big pass rush, and he did. So that's always a feather in my cap. But with that sort of player, you always sort of worry about what happens when their playing time goes from 20 snaps a game to 40 snaps a game. And I think we saw that a little bit in that Ohio State game. But no matter what, against Boise State, he was going to play a lot, given how they were rotating him and Abdul Carter in the nickel spot early in the game. And he was up to the challenge. He rose to that occasion, which I think is a good testament to him. And then Devontae Thomas and Keziah Izzard, I mean, those guys are really, really shouldering a big load. That number 4 defensive tackle, whether it was supposed to be Gilliam or Blanding, hasn't really materialized at this point. And at this point in the season, it's sort of, go with your guys, ride with the proven vets. And that's going to be those two and Durant on that interior. And they have another physical task coming up again against this Notre Dame team. So I think those guys deserve a lot of credit. I hope they got to spend a lot of time in the ice baths once they got, after that Boise State game, and they're going to have to be ready for Notre Dame.
Yeah, I think they got more than ice baths, as Abdul Carter has shown us. And let's finish with a few more defensive names here before we bring on Drew Mentock, who covers Notre Dame for Irish Illustrated in our 24/7 Sports Network. Focus on the Fighting Irish to finish out this episode. But a couple of linebackers. Kobe King's been largely Mr. Consistent, team captain, middle linebacker. I think we relatively know what to expect from him on a week-to-week basis. He continues to prove his value in the playoffs, but it's been Dom DeLuca, who's, again, playing more snaps than we've seen at any point this season, and Tony Rojas, who's been more productive than we've seen at any point this season. I think he had 7 tackles this past matchup. We know what he did the week before that. He was moving around really well on the field, had a 58-yard interception return for a touchdown. And then one more defensive player I wanted to throw in there, and Daniel, take this where you want before we say goodbye. Zakee Wheatley, well-known takeaway king around these parts, but he got to show the world that against Boise State with a couple takeaways, fumble recovery, an interception. And I thought I've noted this to you in the press box a couple times. I thought it really stood out against SMU. I think he's done his best KJ Winston impersonation with some of this open field tackling, doing his best to be kind of an eraser of mistakes at the first 2 levels. Is KJ Winston probably the superior overall defensive player? Yes, I would venture that. But I think Zakee Wheatley has really shown his improvement from last year to this year. I think he's taken it to another level here later in the season. He's a guy who announced he's coming back in 2025. That's a big deal for this defense. But I think it's very notable how he has stepped up in a safety position that just simply hasn't produced or really tested out that depth beyond those 2 guys. So to see him playing at this level right now is a big deal.
Yeah, I asked Anthony Poindexter in the locker room about the game after the game about Wheatley, and he said that he couldn't be more proud of what Wheatley has done in terms of stepping up this year. We all know that his role was probably supposed to look a little bit different if KJ Winston was healthy this entire year, but I think that he's shown that he can be a more well-rounded safety than just that ball hawk. He's always shown that he can be physical. But I think that's gone up, another level this year. And when you project forward, that's really great, to have on the back end of your defense for 2025. So I think that he's done a really nice job. And, also, I think it's been kind of neat to watch him make good on all the offseason hype and all the practice hype that we hear about the takeaways, because he hasn't had that 2-pick game, or his interception totals over the course of his seasons, I think, have all been pretty modest. And so I think to kind of square what we've heard and what they've told us and actually seeing it on the field, in a big spot, I think is pretty cool for him. As for Rojas and DeLuca, I mean, Rojas, I think it's fair to say that entering the postseason that he could have been seen as a little bit of a question mark in terms of what we saw from him over the course of the season. And he's risen to the occasion. I think, he's kind of he might be a little symbolic of this whole defense, how it feels like that everyone has raised their game and everyone has stepped up in their own ways. And so I think to get back to back, really confident performances from him is really neat. We talked about it a little bit after the SMU game. Like, could that pick six serve as some sort of, really just, locking in his confidence and allowing him as the moment for him to take a next step and elevate his game. It looked like that a little bit, the way that he was playing against Boise State. Yeah, sometimes he still doesn't wrap up. Sometimes, he just bounced off Ashton Genty, but the effort is there. And, I think that he doesn't have to tackle Ashton Genty again next week. So I think the arrow is still pointing up for him. And then DeLuca, the one clip was going around of the quick screen out in the flat to Genty, and he was able to haul it in. I think that was, kind of indicative of the type of player he is. And he's another one, one of these stories where it's just a really cool college football story. And for him to be on this stage, I think is pretty neat. And Penn State's going to need all of these guys if they want to beat Notre Dame and if they want to beat whether it's Ohio State or Texas and Atlanta after that.
We'll talk to some of these guys over the weekend. We got a lot of media coverage coming our way as Orange Bowl coverage begins. It's just one bowl to the next here in 2024, going to 2025. Daniel, myself, Mark Brennan, we'll be back with you for another podcast down the road. We'll put more perspective on this matchup after hearing from Penn State players and coaches. And we'll be down in South Florida very soon, broadcasting our podcast from there. Daniel, for now, goodbye, and good to have you back, although we're on the move again very soon.
Thanks, Tyler. Just wanted to give a quick shout out to the listener who said hello to me in downtown Phoenix on New Year's Day. I'm sorry I'm blanking on your name right now, but always appreciate getting to meet some of the listeners and talk a little Penn State out in the wild.
No one finds fans across this globe like Daniel Gallen. Not surprised. All right, talk to you soon, man.
See ya.
Let's shift gears as promised. We'll talk about the Notre Dame Fighting Irish right now. They're next up on the schedule for Penn State. Next up on this podcast is Drew Mentock, who covers Notre Dame for Irish Illustrated within our 24/7 Sports Network. Drew, thank you so much. I know you're coming off of a big Thursday, so thanks for making some time on a Friday to talk Notre Dame and Orange Bowl with us.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on, Tyler. I'm excited to get to know a little bit more about Penn State as well. So.
Yeah, we're all, it's been cram studying for us on a week-to-week basis here with the new playoff system, learning your opponents as the weeks go by. And we knew it would be Notre Dame or Georgia. Ultimately, it's the Fighting Irish. And talk us through what led them here. 23-10 victory in the Sugar Bowl. They were a 1-point favorite for that matchup. So much of the scoring occurred right around halftime, either right before halftime or right after with that kickoff return. What do you make of the overall performance for Notre Dame, and what is the exuberance, the energy around the Fighting Irish community at this moment?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is definitely a fan base that has been waiting for this win for a really long time. This is Notre Dame's first major bowl win since the 1994 Sugar Bowl, which was on January 1st. So 31 years, I think, since their last win of this magnitude. And this is obviously in the playoffs, so even maybe a little bigger deal. So I think people are definitely exuberant. And I think from last night's game, like the big takeaway is just that Notre Dame was able to really out physical Georgia in a lot of ways that maybe we knew that was what they were going to try to do, but obviously you don't know that they can do that to a team like Georgia until they actually do it. And then as you referenced, they struggle in offense. They were the first team to win a playoff game with their 244 yards is the fewest offensive yards for a team to win a playoff game so far. So they really benefited from, as you said, they scored 17 points in 54 seconds of game time, and then they let the defense kind of take over. But they just found ways to get it done and really stressed Georgia as often as they could, and that proved decisive.
They scored those 17 points in less than a minute. The rest of the game featured 16 combined points in 59 minutes. And when we focus in on Notre Dame's victory over Georgia, the SEC champion, obviously there were some questions about their quarterback in Carson Beck. What maybe was different for you for expectations versus reality of what it might look like for 60 minutes of football between Notre Dame and the SEC champs?
Yeah, I mean, I knew Georgia didn't run the ball as well as they have in the past, but I think I was surprised that was the second fewest rushing yards I think Georgia's had all year. So I was kind of surprised to see they really focused on shutting down the run and were willing to give up some big passing plays early. But then they eventually snipped. And I think Gunnar Stockton started 8 for 10 from passing for Georgia for 133 yards. And I think he was around 55% the rest of the way for like 4.7 yards per attempt. So he kind of got going early, and then they really kind of shut him down and took away those big plays. And yeah, Georgia just couldn't get anything on the ground. So it kind of would have been interesting to see what this game would have been like with Carson back, but I think Notre Dame handled the challenge of a guy they really couldn't prepare for very well. They did a good job with that.
Before we talk about some of the specifics about this Notre Dame team and where they are now, let's go way back to September 7th. That was the day when a lot of people probably counted out the Fighting Irish from being in any kind of Final Four, even in the Final 12. Ultimately, they lost at home to Northern Illinois 16-14. That followed an opening victory at Texas A&M. Since then, of course, they've won 12 straight, including a couple playoff games. But take us back to that moment in September and the frustration and ultimately what it took for the Notre Dame Fighting Irish to get from there to here.
Yeah, I think a lot of self-reflection. I mean, that was Marcus Freeman's third loss as a 20-point favorite at home since he's been head coach. So I think it was kind of like, here we go again. I mean, this team had been kind of having the expectations of being in the playoffs all year. They have a show on Peacock that's kind of geared around. They had 2 episodes on the preseason, and then they had 2 episodes appearing like before the playoff, and then another one coming in January. So they even had a TV show kind of geared around a playoff run, it seemed. So yeah, I think at that time people were really like, what is going on? This team can't live up to expectations. But ever since then, they've not only have they won 12 straight games, but they, at the time, I guess their point differential was +4, and now it's plus 24.1, which is the second best in the nation. So they've not only been winning, but they've beat every team by double digits except for Louisville on September 28th. Everyone else they've just kind of not only beat but dominated to a large degree.
They made a quarterback move in the transfer portal last year, bringing Riley Leonard in after his career at Duke, and he's come on board. I think we all witnessed what he can do with his legs. He's a definite rushing threat. That's been apparent for much of this season. When you look at his passing statistics, I believe his highest total on the season is 229 passing yards. He was at 90 yards through the air in the Sugar Bowl. What is the threat that Riley Leonard brings? So I think some people are saying, is he a full-on dual threat, or is he a little underwhelming as a thrower and he's a really strong runner, or is Notre Dame just not utilizing him in the passing game to this point as much as possible? What do we need to know about Riley Leonard? Because when you look at the stat sheet, you look at the game logs, and you watch him play and the way Notre Dame attacks opponents, it is a little bit, kind of foggy in terms of what he is as a quarterback, what he means, and quite frankly, how good he's going to be in this upcoming matchup on Thursday.
Yeah, definitely. I think at times he can really be a true dual threat. I mean, I think he's very willing to take off and run. I think part of the problem with yesterday is he, even though Georgia only sacked him once, he was kind of running for his life a lot at times. So I think that kind of detracted, but he's definitely not a prolific passer. What I would say is he's pretty efficient, especially since that loss to Northern Illinois. I think I'd have to go back and check, but I think excluding last night's game, he's around top 20 in passer rating since then. So he does have some efficient moments. He definitely, I don't think against Penn State can have another 90-yard performance. I think they got to get more done, especially against, Penn State has statistically a much better run defense than Georgia, but he definitely can make some big throws. He doesn't take a lot of throws downfield, but he's fairly efficient at those, and he's been doing more and more of those as the season goes on, with the exception of last night. And Jordan Faison, who's been probably their most explosive receiver, he got hurt. He had a high ankle sprain in the Texas A&M game in the first half, and he is really just getting back to full health in these playoffs, and he's been their leading receiver the last 2 games.
Yeah, dynamic weapon for them. And Riley Leonard on the season, about 2,200 passing yards, 17 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. But the rushing stats jump out: 15 touchdowns on the ground, 751 yards rushing. That's about a 5.5 yard per carry clip. His supporting cast, when we look around that group with you, Jeremiah Love's a 1,000-yard running back, 16 touchdowns on the ground. You look at the receiving group, there's a bunch of guys who have 20-plus catches, but no one has 40 catches on the season. There's no one that really jumps off the stat sheet. There's nothing that really jumps off the stat sheet about this pass attack. And then the offensive line, additionally, can you talk us through what Riley Leonard has in front of him, behind him, alongside him, and who the true game changers are, and maybe where there could be some offensive concern going up against Penn State?
I think the offensive line, going back to fall camp, they've had 8 different starters. They've had 3 go down with pretty significant injuries. They have made one change to get Rocco Spindler, who's been banged up in the starting lineup over the back half of the season. So that's been kind of a work in progress. You mentioned Jeremiah Love. I mean, I think he's one of the most explosive backs in the country. He has, he's also a hard, tough runner, but he can do it a little bit of everything. He did kind of re-injure his knee last night. So that'll be kind of a big thing to monitor, especially against Penn State, which, I mean, even if you go back against the Indiana game, he had over 100 yards rushing, but most of those came on a 98-yard touchdown. And then I think he had 10 the rest of the game. So with Notre Dame, even if their offense is struggling, they might need those big plays from a guy like that. You're right. Riley Leonard doesn't pass a lot or as much as a lot of other quarterbacks, and he does spread it around quite a bit. So there's no main threat. I think going back to Jordan Faison, seeing him kind of get it involved in different ways in the game is probably his biggest weapon outside. My biggest concern is, I think a key thing to the Georgia victory last night was Georgia only had 1 tackle for loss and 1 sack. And this is a team that had 25 tackles for loss in 2 games against Texas. But I also know Penn State has a lot of, premier defensive talent. I sounds like Abdul Carter should be in the game. So can Notre Dame kind of have a repeat performance like that? Because Indiana had quite a few negative plays against them. So it seems like if Penn State can kind of keep them behind the chains, then that's going to really be a problem for Notre Dame.
Since we were briefly on the subject there, Jeremiah Love, you talked about aggravating a knee issue. Maybe that's something to monitor here in the coming days. I'm sure you'll be keeping focus on that on your coverage. Are there any other injury concerns, question marks coming out of the Sugar Bowl that you're aware of, that we should be aware of? Because obviously we've got our attention on Abdul Carter here and where he stands after missing the last 3 quarters against Boise State.
Howard Cross did go down briefly in yesterday's game. He came back in. The broadcast said it was cramps. He has had an issue with also a high ankle sprain. So that's something to kind of monitor, especially after Riley Mills was lost for the season against Indiana. They can't really keep affording to lose these defensive tackles. Howard Cross also had a shoulder injury that he went into the tent for, but he also came back in the game. So I assume those guys are fine. I think the biggest thing is just this, coming back for another physical matchup against a team like Penn State, on 2 less days of rest. Kind of seeing how they hold up and especially for a team that needs to be the most physical, I think, to win this game.
You mentioned the injury to Riley Mills, standout defensive lineman for Notre Dame. He was banged up in the first round of these playoffs. He's going to be out the rest of the way here. How has that impacted their defense and overall? We saw a really impressive performance, and they did a darn good job against Indiana before that. What would you describe as this defense's strongest traits?
Well, the strongest trait is definitely the pass defense, and I would say the secondary. They, at least until yesterday, ranked first in pass efficiency defense. They've been up there with Texas throughout the entire year. Notre Dame leads the nation in turnovers forced, and a lot of those are interceptions. And they're led by Xavier Watts, who's a 2-time consensus All-American, and then they have some really good young corners and some other guys they work in there. On the defensive line, it's kind of interesting because even though they keep losing guys, you mentioned Riley Mills, they kind of have guys step up after they lose them. Like Notre Dame's 2 best edge rushers both got lost for the season with knee injuries in September, Jordan Botelho and Boubacar Traore. And at that time, Riley Mills didn't have a sack. And then he had 7.5 over the last 9 or 10 games. Last night, you had RJ Oben, who's a transfer from Duke, off the edge, had 14.5 sacks for the last 3 years at Duke, hadn't had a single one this year. He stepped up and had a big strip sack that set up Notre Dame's only touchdown drive of the game at the 13-yard line. So they've kind of had these guys step up along the defensive line when you're saying, oh no, they're in big trouble. Who's going to generate any pressure? They have these guys kind of come out of nowhere and step up. So it'll be interesting if they can kind of continue that trend, even as they seem to lose more and more guys.
And as we get closer and closer to this matchup, there's going to be a lot of different talking points. If you had to pick just a couple, as you know it, or as you kind of wrap your head around this matchup, what do you think are the most pressing topics or storylines for Notre Dame against this Penn State team?
I think just kind of getting into some of my Penn State research, I think this is probably the most complete defense they've faced this year and potentially offense. I know Penn State doesn't pass for a ton of yards, but just looking at Drew Allers, I think he's top 20 in yards per pass attempt. So it seems like there's some explosiveness there. So I think just Notre Dame, especially like defensively, don't seem like they can key on one thing. Like they need to be able to stop probably the two best running backs they've faced all year. And they've definitely not seen a tight end like Tyler Warren. So I think kind of seeing how they handle some of those new challenges is kind of my biggest concern, and what they do with some of those weapons. They really, even though they face some good teams, they really haven't seen some of those specific offensive challenges. And this team obviously is led by its defense.
Well, let's finish with this, Drew. You and I both got to get to a 24/7 Sports video hit soon, but let's finish here. What's been the secret sauce for this 12-game win streak? The fact that they're into the semifinal round, they had a breakthrough win against Georgia. What has been the secret, as far as you can gather, under Marcus Freeman this season?
I've referenced physicality a few times, but I think it's with that and just like kind of a confidence and aggressiveness. I mean, you saw how aggressive they were at going after blocked punts early. They do a lot of like special teams fake plays. They go for it on fourth down a lot. I think since then they've really focused on, we're not going to play not to lose anymore, or just kind of go with the expectation. They're going to really play with a lot of confidence, fly around, and really stress the other team and be as disruptive as possible. And I think that's really what's done it ever since, that they've really just come out swinging, and that's really carried the day.
Drew, really appreciate you hopping on with us here. We look forward to continuing our coverage of Notre Dame, Penn State in the coming weeks. I know that we're going to be tapping into your knowledge at Irish Illustrated. Please do the same with us at Lions 24/7. We'll collaborate as much as we need to get to that finish line in the Orange Bowl, and then we'll see what happens. But thanks, Drew, and I'll see you soon on video.
Great. Thanks very much, Tyler.
All right. Take care. That was Drew Mentock from Irish Illustrated within our 24/7 Sports Network. Always great to be able to tap into our experts, as we did throughout the Big Ten campaign for Penn State. We'll get to do that in this round. And if we get to the next one, we'll do it again with a Texas or Ohio State reporter. Before him, you heard from Daniel Gallen, who's done a great job traveling the country, covering this Penn State squad this year. We're all traveling down to South Florida on Monday. Follow our coverage at Lions247.com. Between now and then, we have a lot going on this weekend here in Happy Valley. We'll hear from James Franklin. We'll hear from coordinators. We'll hear from players. The beat goes on, and we're going to be a part of it here at Lions247.com. And oh, by the way, got word from our overlords in the 24/7 Sports Network. We're leaving our 50% sale on until this playoff run ends, one way or another. So as long as Penn State's playing, you can get in for 50% off. Enjoy all of our coverage. Enjoy the transfer portal coverage, recruiting. We're not too far away from all the spring action that coming our way too at this point. So stay with us at Lions247.com. Check in for another podcast to start next week. We'll have a few coming your way leading up to kickoff down in Miami. For now, on behalf of Daniel Gallen and everyone else over at our Lions 24/7 network, I'm Tyler Donahue. We'll talk to you real soon right here on the Lions 24/7 podcast.